I've just had my first full week in university, and yeah, looking back at our vacation, there's one thing that absolutely stood out, because we had to take the train a couple of times, and yes, I do love trains. They're a very nice way to travel, very relaxing. I can get to meet other people and just, yeah. But there is one thing that absolutely blew my mind. How can it be that I've read quite a lot about train tickets getting very, very expensive? Apparently this year there's going to be another very big increase of the price of a typical return train ticket. Initially, the Dutch railway company NS wanted to increase the train ticket price by about 12%, but the ministry decided that that's not allowed. They wanted to change the percentage to about 6-9 if possible. It's around now that they're going to be deciding what the exact percentage is going to be. Well, apparently you don't even have to believe the news. Just in case, here we go for a return to Eindhoven. That one. So the standard price for that is €36.90. That includes €1.50 for the single-use card that you would buy if you were buying the ticket at the machine. Now, there are a couple of very big, some very bad, some not that bad reasons as to why the train tickets are going to be increasing in price. And after this, that's what this video is going to be about. Why the fuck is there so much about increases in train prices? Reason number one, the ultra-capitalist privatization or semi-privatization of the NS company. So it's since around the 1990s that the NS had to start splitting apart into two main companies. There's ProRail, that manages the infrastructure, and there's the NS company that we know now, which basically just runs the trains. There used to be one company, but that one company was making a lot of losses, and the government wanted to reduce spending on the railways and also allow for a bit of healthy competition. Well, we see how that happened in the UK. There are a lot of railway companies that each have their own pricing structure, which led to absolutely massive fares. In the Netherlands, we decided to take it a bit more sensibly. The NS was going to manage the main lines, or the trains that run on it, and we were only giving away concessions to other companies who are going to be running the local lines with a subsidy. NS was going to slowly wean off of a subsidy and get a bit of profit. That happened and it worked fine, except yeah, they were getting new trains purchased and the CEO was able to enrich himself a little bit more, except that this system had one fundamental flaw. There's absolutely no fallback for NS in the event of something like the COVID pandemic, which, just like in many parts of the world, had decreased travel counts extremely due to online lessons and lockdowns and remote work and stuff like that. In general, that has led to an absolute loss for NS, the first time since the partial privatization per se. And that reason number one, the ultra-capitalist privatization or semi-privatization of the NS company. So it's since around the 1990s that the NS had to start splitting apart into two main companies. There's ProRail that manages the infrastructure, and there's the NS company that we know now, which basically just runs the trains. There used to be one company, but that one company was making a lot of losses, and the government wanted to reduce spending on the railways and also allow for a bit of healthy competition. Well, we see how that happened in the UK. There are a lot of railway companies that each have their own pricing structure, which led to absolutely massive fares. In the Netherlands, we decided to take it a bit more sensibly. The NS was going to manage the main lines, or the trains that run on it, and we were only giving away concessions to other companies who are going to be running the local lines with a subsidy. NS was going to slowly wean off of a subsidy and get a bit of profit. That happened and it worked fine, except they were getting new trains purchased and the CEO was able to enrich himself a little bit more, except that this system had one fundamental flaw. There's absolutely no fallback for NS in the event of something like the COVID pandemic, which, just like in many parts of the world, had decreased travel counts extremely due to online lessons and lockdowns and remote work and stuff like that. In general, that has led to an absolute loss for NS, the first time since the partial privatization per se. And that the inflation itself is about 3%, but NS wanted to increase their prices a bit, partially to pay back the losses, and then some. The partial privatization also led to, the CEO being able to enrich himself a little bit more. He gained an absolutely massive salary increase to... Inflation itself is about 3%, but NS wanted to increase their prices a bit, partially to pay back the losses, and then some. The partial privatization also led to, the CEO being able to enrich himself a little bit more. He gained an absolutely massive salary increase to €530,148 in 2024. That was quite a bit more. That's going to be a lot more than the income of a minister. And if you were to take away that full salary, that would be €25 per employee per year extra. And that leads us to a second issue. And that is the salary crises and strikes at NS. In the last couple of months, preferably before the summer, exactly during the exam weeks of universities, a lot of employees of NS went on a strike, most notably the train drivers and conductors. Their salary proposals were at about 7%, according to the labour unions. So it was at this point that I had to break the talking head section, because I thought there were way more things that go into train ticket price than just salary, debt payment and energy prices as well. So let's go through every single one of those things. Well, the first is simply the legal right of NS to operate trains on the main line. Apparently they have to pay for that. And that was the case ever since ProRail got spinned off as an infrastructure management company. This means that NS has to pay for concession costs, to be approved as a railway operator. And they have to pay to ProRail for trackage rights to be able to use the track and the stations. Of course, now that NS can operate the trains, legally speaking, of course, they need a lot of trains, especially to run at this level of timetable that in some places you have a train every 10 minutes. Older trains like the Koploper ICM need maintenance more regularly, and newer trains like the ICNG are going to be purchased to replace those older trains, but NS either needs to save up for them or pay back their loans on them, or both. To actually run the trains, of course, now they're completely inert, so they're going to need electricity. And the electricity prices are also rising at the moment. You know, Vladimir Putin has gone full megalomaniac, and so we decided to cut off their natural gas supply, forcing ourselves to go on to more expensive Qatar and American LNG instead. Now, NS runs the trains completely on wind power, but standard energy prices still apply, and those are dependent on gas price. Another obvious cost for NS is personnel. There have been worker strikes at both NS and ProRail quite often in the last year or two, and those obviously are going to lead to new regulations and higher salaries, which might end up costing NS more, even though it benefits the worker, and that's a good thing. It does come at the expense of raised ticket prices. Another cost that NS has to pay are insurances. Even though trains are the safest transportation method in the world and the Dutch railway network is quite punctual, it's not always perfect. So, NS has to be able to pay back those who have been affected by incidents or significant delays. And that requires a liability insurance of some kind, as well as a big pocket of save up money. And then we come along to the costs of, running a business, like the salespeople, marketing, and the CEO of the company, Wouter Koolmees, who apparently earns over 300,000 euros. Again, that's a lot. Maybe even more than the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Even though a lot of the shares, all of them, are in the hands of the Dutch government, technically making the NS a public company. Which means that all that remains from the sale of the train tickets, as well as other incomes like station services, the shops at larger train stations, gets funneled straight into the state pocket. But weirdly enough, when the NS is showing a debt like it did during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government doesn't seem too eager to subsidize the NS, even though they own all the shares. Many people also compare the NS train ticket price to gas price. Well, that's not an apples to apples comparison. With the gas, when you just pay for gas and don't have a car, all you'll end up is a puddle of flammable stuff that you can't do anything with other than light stuff on fire. The point is, you need a lot of the same things, except on a way smaller scale, for a motor vehicle commute. So let's compare those things that NS pays for, the types of payment, with an electric car, which is more of an apples to apples comparison. Basically, NS has similar costs, except economies of scale apply, So even an electric car, which we've compared against the NS costs types just before, is only going to carry 1 to maybe 3 or 4 people in many cases. And during a commute, it's typically just going to be 1. Whereas during the same rush hour commute, the trains from NS can pack hundreds or thousands of people per train set use. And often they run coupled and or again at higher frequencies, so that number increases even more. Another cost I have to mention for both NS and a car owner is parking, or rather NS pays much less to keep their trains in storage, and that is because they need to keep their trains in storage much less. Maybe during the night, but not during the day when everyone is traveling. Especially in rush hour, almost every train is going to be utilized. Whereas a car owner might have their car parked for about 90% of the time in a day. And so what I definitely see in this is that, depending on your situation, the cost of car ownership versus the cost of having to pay for a train ticket every day return trip, the car ownership cost might actually end up outgrowing the cost of your train ticket, especially if you have a subscription that allows you to travel for free or at a discount, because the price I showed on the ticket machine is a full fare. The special subscription, you can actually get 40 or even 100% discount on the journey if it's within certain parameters. For instance, off-peak hours, and a more expensive subscription, which might be worth it if you're commuting by rail every day. Well, that's going to be a bit more expensive, but it might actually still be cheaper than, having to get your driver's license and get your car. Although the car has one big benefit, and that is door-to-door transport, the public transit system in the Netherlands solves that pretty much perfectly by having buses, trams and metro trains connect to the NS train stations so that you can travel in public transit to your final destination. And oftentimes you can even have a car share car or a bicycle right at the station on loan. So you loan it from NS and you return it, and you just pay only for what you use. So overall, I'm not saying no one really needs a car or something. I'm just saying that comparing the price of a train ticket to the price of just the gas or electricity that you put in your car is not an apples to apples comparison. You have to compare the train ticket against the whole picture of owning a car to get the full picture. But as I'll return you to talking head, it's time to talk about some of the other situations that exist and that can make train travel quite a lot cheaper than it even is right now. So, as a couple of examples, in Germany there was actually once the 9 euro ticket in 2024 that everybody took advantage of, locals and tourists, because it allowed you to travel unlimited through the entire Federal Republic of Germany and into border areas as well, as long as you're doing that using local trains, buses, trams and metros. Going a step further, Luxembourg has actually made their public transit completely free within the country in second class. Now, the 9 euro ticket was obviously unsustainable by itself, or at least deemed so by the government. So they decided to raise the price afterwards to 50 and then to 60 something euros at the moment. It was actually intended directly as a way to mitigate the consequences of the energy crisis. Which brings us to the solutions for these higher train ticket prices that we're seeing now. The first is in fact to reduce the volatility of train ticket prices, which has two different things that the government has to do. First of all, they have to be willing again to give out subsidies to NS in case of a crisis. And secondly, they're going to need directly to invest in renewable energy sources so that we're no longer dependent on fossil fuels or any kind of combustion fuels for our power supply as a country. And I've actually made a couple of videos about that before and a couple of statements, But there was yet another side note that I had to forget because I was only talking about costs that NS makes compared to a car owner and how similar those are. There's also another little thing. If there is more demand for a given thing, you would normally expect prices to increase, right? For things that have to be made individually, that is true. But for something like public transit, it actually works better when it comes to the pricing, the cost versus revenue, if more people actually use it, and that can drive train ticket prices down and support for the public transit system from the government and the general public up. And that not only means having to, again, invest a lot as a government and as the company NS into the trains themselves and as pro-rail into the infrastructure. Most notably because of delays and older trains that might need maintenance or revisions. But perhaps more importantly, the government should ideally stop building out more and wider highways. Because if more people use the car, well, Now all of a sudden you have less people who take the train for a commute, for instance, and thus the train ticket prices have to rise to be able to accommodate the difference. Now this only works to an extent. If the demand is higher than the capacity of the network, of course prices have to increase again to allow for investment. But that is where government subsidy can step in. In fact, in Luxembourg, again, that has worked so incredibly well that their government was able to pay every single euro of the cost that the public transit company makes, and therefore to make all public transit free. Now, in the Netherlands that might not be that much of a desirable or attainable result, because as another alternative to driving, we also of course have very good cycling infrastructure, but at least it should be possible to make train travel completely free intercity if the government is willing to invest in the railway network directly, as well as in solving the energy crisis, which also helps reduce the volatility of train tickets in the immediate term. Another thing we can do to help more people use public transit and thus to reduce the per person cost is actually to make public transit more attractable for people outside of urban areas. For instance, by making it more accessible by local public transit, or by preventing lesser used stations from being closed. So I'm not really giving any definitive solutions here, just a couple of things that might work out in positively for NS and ProRail and generally the popularity of public transit. So with that little quick outro out of the way, I'm going to see you another time. Bye bye! I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, please give a thumbs up and share this video with all your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. And by the way, if you watched the last video I made, you might have caught me forgetting to say the general goodbyes.